In the summer of 1720, the smartest man in England lost his life savings in a single day. His name was Isaac Newton, the man who had mapped the motion of the planets, who had reduced the universe to a handful of equations. And in a matter of weeks, he watched his fortune evaporate into thin air. He's often quoted, though historians still argue over the exact wording, as saying something like this: "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." Whether or not those were his precise words, the sentiment was real, because what destroyed Newton wasn't a war, or a famine, or a bad investment in the ordinary sense. It was a company that, on paper, did almost nothing, and yet became, for a few frantic months, the most valuable enterprise on Earth. This is the story of the South Sea Bubble. One of the strangest, most theatrical financial disasters in human history. And by the end of it, you're going to understand exactly why a genius who could predict the orbit of comets couldn't see a crash coming from 10 feet away. Let's rewind to 1711. Britain is buried in debt. Decades of war with France have left the government owing enormous sums it can't easily repay. Enter a group of financiers with a proposal that, on the surface, sounds almost too clean to be true. Here's the pitch, boiled down to something you'd actually understand. Imagine your credit card debt is spiraling out of control. A company shows up and says, "Give us your debt. In exchange, we'll give you shares in our business instead." You're no longer a debtor, you're a shareholder. That's the entire premise of the South Sea Company. It would absorb a huge slice of Britain's national debt, and in return, the government would hand it something valuable, a monopoly on trade with Spain's colonies in South America. Slaves, sugar, gold. That was the promise. An entire continent of opportunity sealed off from every other British merchant, granted exclusively to this one company. There was just one problem. Spain barely let the company trade at all. In practice, the South Sea Company was allowed one ship a year into Spanish-American ports. One ship. That's it. But here's the thing about a good story. The truth doesn't actually matter if the narrative is compelling enough. And the South Sea Company's directors understood something that con artists throughout history have understood. You don't need a real business. You need a believable one. So they started talking. Whispers spread through London's coffee houses of unimaginable riches waiting across the Atlantic. Mountains of silver. Endless demand for English wool. The share price began climbing, not because profits were rising, but because belief was rising. People weren't buying a company. They were buying a story, and betting that someone even more gullible would buy it from them for more tomorrow. By the spring of 1720, the frenzy was total. The stock price, which had sat around £128 in January, would eventually rocket past 1,000. Members of Parliament bought in. Dukes and duchesses bought in. Servants pooled their wages to buy a single share. Newton himself bought early, made a tidy profit, and, like so many of us would, sold. Then watched the price keep climbing without him. And this is the moment to be honest with yourself. If you were standing in a London coffeehouse in June 1720, watching your neighbour turn £100 into 1,000 in a matter of weeks, would you have walked away? Almost nobody did. Newton didn't either. He bought back in, at the top. Every bubble has a moment where the story stops adding up. For the South Sea Company, it started with a number that simply didn't make sense. The company's own directors knew the stock price had completely detached from anything resembling real trade revenue. So to keep the machine running, they did something clever and ultimately catastrophic. They started lending people the money to buy their own shares. Think of it like a car dealership that hands you the cash to buy the car, using the car itself as collateral. As long as the car's value keeps rising, everyone's happy. The moment it stops, the whole arrangement collapses in on itself. That's essentially what the South Sea Company was doing, creating its own demand, financing the very mania that was inflating its stock. The first real crack came from an unlikely direction, a rival scheme. A pair of competing bubble companies, formed in the same frenzy, needed cash, so their investors began quietly selling South Sea shares to raise it. It was a small sale, a minor withdrawal from the machine. But in a market built entirely on confidence, small cracks travel fast. Then came the questions that always come at the end of a con. Where, exactly, is the money? Merchants and financiers who actually understood international trade started asking why a company with a fortune on paper still couldn't produce meaningful shipping records, real profits, or a functioning trade route. The answer, when people finally sat down and looked closely at the books, was almost nothing. The value of the entire enterprise had been built on a monopoly that barely functioned and a share price sustained by nothing but momentum. By August 1720, the price had stalled. And a stalled bubble is a dying bubble, because the entire scheme depended on constant new buyers arriving to push the price higher. Once that stopped, the people who'd borrowed heavily to buy shares, remember that car dealership loan scheme, suddenly needed to sell just to cover what they owed. Selling pressure met buying silence. And the house of cards began to shake. The collapse, once it started, was brutal and fast. By September, the stock had fallen by more than half. By December, it had lost nearly 90% of its peak value. Fortunes that had been built in weeks were destroyed in days. Members of Parliament who had accepted bribes and free shares to support the scheme were exposed and disgraced. Some were expelled from office, and a few directors saw their personal estates seized to compensate ruined investors. Thousands of ordinary people, clerks, widows, small landowners who had poured their savings into the frenzy, were left with nothing. And Newton, the man who had once calculated the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn with mathematical certainty, walked away having lost a sum equivalent to a small fortune, reportedly somewhere around £20,000, an almost unthinkable amount for the era. The most rigorous, rational mind in Europe had been undone by the one force his equations couldn't touch: crowd psychology. So why does this story still matter 300 years later? Because the mechanism never really went away. Swap trade monopoly with South America for revolutionary blockchain technology or guaranteed returns from a hedge fund no one can quite explain, and you're looking at the same basic shape. A story compelling enough that people stop asking how the money is actually made, replaced instead by the far more dangerous question of how much more it might be worth tomorrow. The South Sea bubble didn't fool people because they were stupid. It fooled people, including one of the greatest scientific minds who ever lived, because the story was good, the momentum was real, and the fear of missing out is one of the oldest, most reliable weaknesses in human psychology. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If you had watched your neighbor turn £100 into 1,000 in a matter of weeks, are you completely sure you'd have done any better than Newton? Let me know in the comments.